This episode of the House of Mystery is brought to you by Legacy Food Storage. The best way to protect your family is by being prepared. LegacyFoodStorage.com.
Crime and Forensics with Stephen David Lampley, your crime and forensic source from coast to coast.
Hi, I'm Mark Stocker. I was the original composer and sound designer for the hit show Forensic Files, and you're listening to Crime and Forensics with Stephen David Lampley.
You know you're lied to, right? It's not if you're lied to, it's do you know when it happens? Studies show that the average person can only catch a lie about 54% of the time. Heck, you might as well just flip a coin. But studies also show that a person who has been properly trained in lie detection can detect lies about 90% of the time. A big difference. Stephen presented his How to Catch a Liar session at the 2018 CrimeCon at the Gaylord Opryland Hotel and Convention Center, and had to be moved from the Washington Conference Room into the Presidential Ballroom due to the enormous number of registrations to hear his program. Even in the Presidential Ballroom, it was standing room only with 850 people seated. You can have this session brought to your company or organization. Go to StephenDavidLampley.com for more information.
Hello and welcome back to Crime and Forensics. I am your show host, Stephen David Lampley. We have a special show for you today. It's the second part in a two-part series, and if you heard the first, then you're going to want to hear this one. You may not know the name Buddy Barrow, but you will readily recognize the name of Buddy's uncle. The names of Bonnie and Clyde are known the world over. And today on the show, we have Buddy Barrow, the nephew of Clyde Barrow. We're also joined by our good friend and regular show guest, Cheryl McCollum, who is the director of the world-famous Cold Case Investigative Research Institute and has worked on some of the top cold cases in history, including Tupac Shakur, Chandra Levy, Natalie Wood, and others. I want to welcome you both to the show.
Thank you so much.
You, sir.
All right, let me do like we did on the last show, Cheryl. Let me start with you, if you don't mind. And you've gotten to know Buddy fairly well since y'all first met. And like I said on the first show, I'm still a little agitated that I missed the party with everyone, but, you know, life happens. You've come to know Buddy fairly well. Tell us about Buddy, Cheryl.
Well, we all missed you at that party, too. Well, here's the deal. If Raylene is everybody's grandmama, Buddy is everybody's uncle, but he's the fun uncle. But let me tell you about him. He's fearless. He's no nonsense. He is also deeply loyal. But y'all, he is funny. From the time I picked them up at the airport until the time I dropped them off the next night, I laughed every second we were together. And, you know, one thing that I admire about Buddy is, again, his loyalty to his family, his loyalty to the truth, and his ability to look at it so globally. Because, again, when he took Bonnie's poem and just dissected it line by line for the group, you're talking about 100 people that didn't make a sound throughout that entire thing and were just able to absorb what he was trying to show and trying to teach, which I had never seen anybody do. I'd never heard of anybody do anything like it, and it was just extraordinary. But the last thing I can say about Buddy is that, you know, in a very, very short period of time, that if you're ever cutting through Dallas and you need anything, you had a flat tire or you had any other kind of trouble, he'd be right there. That you just know it.
Buddy, if you would, let's sort of set the tone for the show, and if you would tell us about your Uncle Clyde. Now, we all know, like I said, we all know what the movies and articles tell us, but from your perspective, who was your uncle? Tell us about his life as a child and who he was growing up before he met Bonnie.
Well, I'll tell you a little story that I heard from my grandmother had wrote down in her memoirs. It was about Clyde when he was probably about 6 years old. They said that he was outside playing, and some relative had given him some money or some change in what they had, and all at once he disappeared, and nobody had seen him for a couple of hours, and they all ran outside looking for him, and nowhere to be found. So then the whole family got together and went to all the stock tanks, went to neighbors, knocking on doors, and like I said, he'd been gone a couple of hours, and Kimmy had to walk outside, and here comes Clyde walking down the street, just a whistling away, and his mom walked out. She says, "Where have you been?" She said, "We've been frantic trying to find you." He said, "Well, gosh, Mom, I had money." And I said, "It ain't no good unless you spend it." And I walked a couple of miles to the store and got me a bag of candy. She said, "Son, don't you ever do anything like that. From now on, you always tell me where you are and that you're safe and that you're okay." And she made him promise, and he kept it all the way to the day he died. He was quite a bit of an adventurous.
Well, he's right. If you got money, you got to spend it.
Well, that's a kid, If you got money,
it
ain't no good unless you can spend it.
What's 2 miles when when there's candy at the store and you have cash?
Yeah, and that's a 6-year-old, and that's a 6-year-old.
Wow. Yes, he was an adventurer, that's for sure. Now, how did they meet, buddy? How did Bonnie and Clyde meet?
Well, Clyde had been working for this candy factory, and he had a couple of buddies that was working there with him by the name of Clay. And, as you get friends where you work, and, you start palling around together. And they had invited Clyde over to their home. They was having a little family gathering, and Clyde showed up. Of course, Bonnie was already there with her brother, and which her brother had married a Clay girl. And, of course, when they met, it was just a spark right off the bat. And he went in the kitchen and made a couple of cups of hot chocolate, gave Bonnie for one, and he drank the other, and they were inseparable from that day on.
We talked a little bit with Raylene on the last episode, and yeah, we all know that they did things that should not have been done, but there's truly, between the two of them, was a love story, wasn't it?
Well, the Depression was a terrible time in America. There were some pretty destitute people, all over, especially around the Dallas area, because these families had moved and they'd lost their farm due to bank foreclosures. They had a dust bowl going on. There was no way their crops had failed, and they couldn't get money to buy their necessities for the farm. And next thing you know, they couldn't make their payments, and they just lost everything they had. And they ventured to Dallas, where there was a bigger city, and maybe they had a chance to make a living. In that day and time, I would have hated to think that I'd have to sit and watch my children starve to death, without you doing something. And I'm sure Clyde and Bonnie had suffered through that and seen the hardships of many, many families. And you wanted to try to do as much as for them as you could. And when my grandfather moved to West Dallas, they were just, destitute. And of course, Dallas had taken all the families and moved into a campground on the other side of Dallas, not in Dallas County anymore. And it was an unincorporated area. There was no sanitation. There was no food. There was no water. And you just had to be the best you could. Well, a lot of these kids, saw the mother and the father destitute, and they were old enough. And, if a man had a couple of chickens, and it wasn't unusual for one of them to disappear, to feed his family. And that's what a lot of people had to do. I mean, my dad always told me, you never break the law till you get caught. And then when they got caught, then law made an example out of them.
Yeah. Yeah. And you touched on that. And then that sort of hits with my family. My dad was born in 1934, right smack in the middle of the Depression. About 6 months after he was born, his dad was killed in a car accident, and that left my grandmother of course, she had no job and certainly no hopes of finding a job. And so she ended up doing the best she could, which was giving my dad to cousins, which was the Lampley family. Mm-hmm. And that was the only way she could be sure that her son could eat and have a home. And you know how hard that had to be. And those times were very, very tough, very, very rough times, I'm sure. Now, it's my understanding.
Most of these people, learn how to borrow around themselves. If my grandfather had a well, the only well, he dug him a well, and he was the only one in the area who had water that was, sustainable to drink. Mm-hmm. And people would bring a pig, he says, hey, would you take his pig and would you give me a couple of bales of water? And he did that. And there was never any money that ever exchanged their hands, but that's the way a lot of them did. They managed to survive because they helped each other. And that's, that I can tell you a story about Clyde when he was on the run. And he seen all these destitute families going, on what they call sharecroppers, and they were all going to different farms all over the United States. And he would get in with these people knowing that, they didn't have no money. And if he had some money, he'd get in with them. And these people didn't care where that money came from. And if they had a pot of beans, or bread, or whatever else, he gave the money to them. And they were glad to feed him because money was hard to get.
Sure. Now, it's my understanding, and like I said, you can read anything, but I read this somewhere. It's my understanding that when Clyde's family initially moved to Dallas, that they lived under a wagon. Is that true?
You're right. Correct. My grandfather only had a white mule and a wagon. That's what they loaded all their belongings up and went to Dallas. At that time, they were putting these destitute people under the Trinity River Viaduct and the Houston Street Viaduct. And these people had to forage for themselves. And of course, the city of Dallas, they had so many of the city of Dallas said, no, we can't have this in our city. So they moved them out in an incorporated area called the Campground in West Dallas. And like I said, you had to fringe for yourself because nobody was helping you. They couldn't get no kind of assistance from anybody. The only thing with the difference in the Barrow family, they had four of the grown children who had already moved to Dallas and had established themselves, and they were helping the parents the best they could. The younger children, of course, seen all this, starvation and sickness going on, and they got bitter because of it. Because they felt like the government had really instituted this, and as long as the fat cats were getting their money, they didn't care about anybody else.
And when I read that, I thought, that's sad that a family it's such a bad situation that they're living under a wagon.
That's under the elements. That's open air. You're subject to heat, cold, rain, and you're doing everything you can to keep your family healthy. And a lot of people died, in that area. They just kept giving themselves back and forth, different, malaria and stuff like that. And, it was pretty bad.
And I asked Raylene this, what has it been like for you to be a family member of Clyde Barrow?
Well, when I was growing up, my families sheltered they sheltered the kids. I mean, the young kids who came up, during the early 40s and after World War II. And they sheltered us kids from even discussing us around the children. Mm-hmm. Now, if the family wanted to talk about Clyde or Bonnie, they'd always tell the kids, says, hey, we got to talk about some certain people. We want you to go outside. And I was kind of a inquisitive kid. When they told me to do something, I was kind of hesitant, especially if they wanted to talk about something I wanted to hear. And my grandfather used to have this water cooler outside his window because they didn't have air conditioners back there. They just had these water fans blowing in the house. And my dad told me 2 or 3 times, now you go outside, you're to be seen, not heard. And so I go outside and just have to be diddy-bopping by this window cooler, and I thought, man, I can hear everything they were talking about. So they kept mentioning these names, and I thought, well, I wonder how come I never saw these people. They must live out of state or something. They didn't know they'd been killed. So the other grown, older kids were out playing, and so I went up there and said, hey, man, who's this Clyde? Who's this Bonnie? Who's this Buck? They said, you don't know anything about that? Well, they had my attention there, bud. And I said, I'm going to hear this story. And of course, I'd go and ask my dad. He said, I don't want to talk about this. I'll tell you about this later. And then all at once we went to my aunt's house, my youngest aunt's house. And of course, I'm the first one out of the car, run to the house. And just as I went by this coffee table, I seen these picture albums sitting out, and I seen this car just full of bullet holes. I said, what in the world? So I'm flooding through the pages. And of course, my dad comes in and he said, hey. And he closed the albums. I said, well, has anybody heard of this? He said, boy, I'll tell you later. Right now, you're too young. I'll tell you when you get older. And so I started, doing my own little investigating, and then when I became in school one time, I guess I was probably 8 or 9 years old, and got out for school summer break. My dad was a truck driver, and he says, hey, you want to go with me on some trips? I said, hey, I'm ready. So we loaded up the truck. We go through Oklahoma. He told me about Springtown. He showed me Atoka prison, and go to Missouri and all this stuff. And he started talking about these different things. And I said, wow, man, I still didn't know anything about Bonnie and Clyde other than, they had been killed and they would probably done something wrong. Mm-hmm. And so my dad got to talking about this. And so I learned, and I said, well, Pop, how come they did this? He said, boy, I'm through talking about this. We'll talk about this some other time. So I learned real quick to keep my ears open and my yap shut, because that was the only way I was going to learn anything.
Yeah.
And, and little by little, and then when the 1967 movie came out, my family just went berserk. They said, oh, my God, we're going to have to relive this again. And, I can remember my oldest aunt saying, she said, my God, the kids have been dead so many years. Why won't they let those kids rest in peace and let us just go on with our lives without having to answer the people's questions, because after that, we had law enforcement coming to our doors. We had reporters, and how in the world they found us, I don't know. But we constantly had to move to get away from it.
Wow.
And it never failed within, and this is 40-something years later. And we move, and it's not but 3 days later, we get a knock on the door from the local sheriff saying, hey, we know who you are. We wish to let you know that we know who you are, and you're in our precinct, And this is, 40-something years later, and my God, the people that had lived through this wanted to just let it die, go
Sure.
away, because they had lived it. They lived that horrible time. They witnessed what their siblings had done, and the people it affected, and there was nothing they could say or do except feel the sorrow and the hurt that it all caused, both the people who was, involved and the people who suffered from it.
I find, and it seems to be a society thing. And Cheryl, let me ask you a question related to this. How much of an impact does that have on society? In other words, Raylene talked about this a little bit. Now Buddy's mentioned it. It seems that once a family is involved in something, it seems that the rest of the family has to pay for that. Talk about that, if you would, for us.
Well, I think that's absolutely the case. And that's the story in the first segment that I was saying, that my grandmother was guilty of doing that. That if she went to high school with somebody that she deemed was not up to par, to deal with, then their children and their children's children, would follow suit as far as she was concerned. And we see the opposite is true. People give automatic credibility to the preacher's children or to somebody that has some type of status, like a banker maybe, or the attorney in town. So it works both ways, and in both directions you can be dead wrong. Where again, you might have somebody that is, living over there in the bottom, in the cut, that might give you the shirt off their back, whereas the banker's going to walk right past you starving in the street. So again, society, we like to talk about giving people second chances and these feel-good stories, but a lot of times in absolute practice, it's just not true. And again, Clyde Barrow tried to go straight more than once. Couldn't get a job. They wouldn't let him keep a job. Even the police would go after him to make sure that, he was run out of town. I mean, what are you supposed to do?
Yeah. Well, it's like we talked about earlier. Your life sometimes forces, you to do things you wouldn't do. And I'm not saying that life maybe forced him to do the things they did, but sometimes in life you're put in situations that you feel like you just have no other option.
Absolutely.
You just feel like there's nothing else there. Buddy, let me ask you a question. Now, I was 9 years old. My dad had just been killed in a car accident, and I guess I was learning to spread my wings somewhat, as much as a 9-year-old is allowed to do so. And I didn't live a sheltered life, but I started wanting to do things, and I guess maybe escaping and looking for things. And I found myself wanting to go to the theater that I had no interest in really doing much before. And at that time, it was just a few months after my dad had passed, there was a movie playing in Nashville, Bonnie and Clyde. And I'll be honest, I knew nothing about Bonnie and Clyde, but for somehow the movie drew me, and I wanted to go see it. My mom took me to it, and I was, I guess, mesmerized, and I became really interested in them as a couple. How accurate? Tell our listeners, if you will, how accurate was that film?
Well, we felt like it was more like a slapstick comedy, than facts. There's actually only two parts in the movie that was probably the most accurate. And that was the Joplin shootout, and that was the Dexfield Park, where they, ambushed them there in the park. And of course, the ambush itself, when they killed them, was, very fictionalized. There was a lot of untruths in it, and of course, when me and Raylene, I had my youngest aunt was getting in her late 80s, and she knew she didn't have much time, and she basically come out of the closet and wanted to expose some of these things that were being wrote about them, the movies. She said if they're going to be dramatized in movies and the radios and newspapers are going to write about them. Every anniversary was something coming out in the papers, and this was going on. And my aunt says, "I've had enough." She said, "If they're going to do this, and Clyde and Bonnie are going to be part of history," she said, "the truth makes a heck of a better story than all this, romanticized stuff that you see in the movies." She said it was nothing like that. It was a horrible time. And she said, so she recruited me and Raylene because she knew that she didn't have much time on this earth. She says, "I want y'all to carry on after I'm gone, and make sure that people understand the truth and not think this is some kind of glorious, event, because it was a horrible time in America, and all this romanticized stuff is because it was nothing glamorous about the way they had to live and the prices they paid for, their misdeeds, because they got there because of their own misconduct. And, but family's family, and you stick together no matter what the deal. And basically that's, how I look at it anyway.
Well, and I agree with you. It doesn't matter what your sons or your daughters or your mom or your dad, or they're still your son, your daughter, your mom and dad.
The parents always feel like they let their children down, and at the time they thought they were doing the best they could, and then when you have something happen, and then something happens to your children, you look back and blame yourself because you just wish that you'd taken a little more time with your children's problems, and that's the way a lot of parents felt that way. Kimmy, my grandmother, she hated to see her son put himself in that predicament because she was afraid that, he'd be dying laying on the side of the road, and she couldn't go to him, even to assist him, because she put herself and her own life in jeopardy. But that was her child, and she felt like she needed to do it, and it was horrible for both parents to go through that, and anybody's parents to go through that.
Sure. Now, and of course, the movie we've already established there was only a couple of things in the film that were remotely accurate. What other stories or things about your Uncle Clyde that you're aware of that are misconceptions or just outright lies that need to be explained and cleared up?
Well, my grandmother said that once Clyde had been convicted of a crime, he went to prison and paid his dues, but they sent him to here's a 19-year-old boy who's sent to one of the most harsh prison systems in the United States. When you go there, your chances of walking out of there are very, very slim, because a lot of people don't understand. A lot of these guards, the prison would offer them $30-something a head for attempting to escape, and once you kill that prisoner, you got an extra $30 a month. And so that was a routine. And if one of those guards tell you that night that tomorrow you're going to escape, you're a dead man. So Clyde had been working out in the fields, and one of the prisoners that he was closely connected to by the name of Ralph Fultz, they beat him unmerciful. And Clyde could not stand to see what these guards were doing to him. And he's standing there with his clenched fist, and one of the guards looked at him and says, "Boy, you want some of this?" Well, and then one of the guards talked to him. He says, "Son, tomorrow you're going to escape." So what did Clyde do? The next day, he goes gets a buddy to chop his toes off. So they throw him in the infirmary. Little did he know, 2 weeks, a week or so later, he's paroled. He did all that for nothing.
Wow.
And when my grandmother said he came out of prison, he was a changed human being. He told her, he says, "There will be never another human being put their hands on me like that again." And he hated some person who had an authority and rubbed his nose in it, and he hated that. And it was all because of what this 19-year-old boy witnessed in prison, especially when the guards let these, convicts in there rape these young kids, and he was traumatized after that.
Sure.
And this is where they said that Clyde went from a schoolboy to a rattlesnake. And like he said, he vowed that there would be no other human being put their hands on him like that.
Well, I can't say that I blame the man. I wouldn't want that either.
Hey, Stephen?
Yes.
Buddy, why don't you talk a little bit about the secret codes and the secret messages and the nicknames that Clyde would use? as well as who he might have fashioned himself by.
Well, when Clyde was killed, there was a book in the car. It was about the life of Jesse James. And when Bonnie wrote her last poem, that's the first stanza it starts with. You've heard the story of Jesse James, of how he lived and died. If you need to read something, this is a story of Bonnie and Clyde. So it starts off with Jesse James. Why? Because when Jesse James' life was going on, the railroad was taking everybody's property, whether you wanted to sell it or not. If you didn't sell it to them, they would hire a bunch of white men to dress up as Indian, kill the whole family. There's nothing stopping that railroad to put the railroad through their homes. And Jesse James became bitter with the railroad and the establishments that had set themselves up, and they were heartless and mean and all that, just taking people's property. And so when Clyde read that, he said, that's basically what's happening here, because all the big corporations they're not hurting from any of the depression. A lot of these big cats the banks are not being hurt by it. And so Clyde struck out. And when he robbed a filling station, he would look for a big petroleum company. Normally they were run by, people who were trying to make a living, and it wasn't their money that he was taking. He was taking from a big petroleum company. And the railroads, he did the same thing. He went to ticket offices, robbed the ticket offices, and he would go to big corporations where he knew that there was a payroll agent going to the bank, and he'd watch him. He'd rob the payroll offices, So that's what he was patterning himself after, because he had read the story of Jesse James. Now, in 1934, they put a wiretap on my grandparents' home. And because they had the only telephone one of the only telephones in the area, and of course it was a party line, and law enforcement had put a wiretap on their phone. Well, my grandmother knew this. So one day she's talking on the phone. My grandmother says, I got to let you go. The Howards are out front. I want to see them before they leave. Okay. And it's just a little bit later, there's a phone call that comes from the local drugstore and says, this is Howard. He said, I need to speak to Billie Jean. She said, well, she's not here. I'll have her call you. So sure enough, Billie Jean calls Mr. Howard, and she says, we need to meet. I need to see you. She says, well, when do we need to meet? He says, good and dark. Well, okay, Mr. Howard. Does anybody know what the name of Jesse James' alias was? It was Tom Howard. So, and the police never picked this up. So when Clyde called, he was Mr. Howard.
And I was about to ask you that question. There were several meetings between Bonnie and Clyde and family. Is that, of course, you just described that incident. How is it that they were able to meet with family and not get caught?
Well, what they would do, my grandmother would say, hey, she'd call the kids and say, hey, I've got a great big pot of beans and some cornbread. There's any way y'all can come over. And so that was the cue to the family that Clyde and Bonnie, they were fixing to meet Clyde and Bonnie. Now, my grandmother and my dad were the closest one to Clyde. He trusted those two more than anything. And he would get word to them by coming by the store and throwing out a Coke bottle with the messages, telling them where to meet him. Now, he didn't do this on the phone. So they had little ways of doing that. And of course, they always met out what Bonnie called the Great Divide. It's a little area between West Dallas and Irving. It's no man's land. It's down in the river bottoms. It flooded a lot. A lot of people didn't go down in there because it was, just a rough terrain. And they happened to have a little trail, because when Singleton ended, this little road called Hunter Farrell Road started up. And they'd go down into the levees, and they'd meet down in this designated area. It was not patrolled by Dallas County, and it was not patrolled by the Irving Police Department. So it was a safe spot for them. And normally that's where they always met, which is probably, I'd say, less than 5 miles from the filling station. And they'd meet down there and have their I know there was one time that they met down there, and then they never met in the same place twice. Now, there's a story that says they did, but they didn't. They actually met a couple of miles away from there, and the police got word of it, and that the family was meeting, and it was in Sowers, Texas, and they set up an ambush. This is where they almost got Bonnie and Clyde, because this is the day after my grandmother's birthday, which was May 21st, 1934, and Clyde and Bonnie were there to give my grandmother her birthday present. And of course, Clyde hadn't got it. He said, "Look, I will give it to you tomorrow, and we'll meet at this other location." And they went out there. Clyde went and got his mother a present, and they were meeting that night to get her that present. Mm-hmm. And someone very, very close to this family only knew that, and somehow the police had got one of the boys and took him down in what they call the Trinity River Constitutional. And my dad said it was horrific. They really tortured you. And my dad says when they got through with you, you sang like a canary. And so they took this 17-year-old boy down there and did that to him. And of course, I'm sure he slipped. And we pretty well know who it was, and nobody, my family never held anything against the kid, and just, so that was just something that happened and nobody controlled it. But that's where they almost got him in 1933, November 21st.
Wow. Now, I'm sort of curious. Have you ever had any contact with the family from the posse that was there that day on May 23rd in 1934?
Oh, yeah. I knew two of the ambushes officers real well, Bob Alcorn and Ted Hinton. Bob Alcorn was, in my view, one of the most upstanding officers of that whole bunch. I liked Ted. He was kind of a boaster, braggart kind of guy, and he liked to come to my house or home when I was already a teenager. And my dad didn't want to talk about this, but Ted wanted to discuss, the things about the Barrow family. But he helped my dad quite a bit, and my dad would let him talk, because, like I said, he'd had a trucking firm, and my dad couldn't get a job, and Ted helped my dad, and that's something we really, I admired in the man for him doing that, but yet the family did not like to discuss all this stuff, over at hash and hash. And Bob Alcorn was one of the officers that had gathered the personal property after Clyde and Bonnie were slain, and didn't keep any, mementos or anything like that. And he actually returned everything personal to the family that belonged to Clyde and Bonnie to his family. And I think that was outstanding when a lot of officers knew that this stuff was going to be valued someday. And sure enough, it has turned out that way.
That's awesome that he would turn over that to the family. Mm-hmm. That's just neat.
And he didn't, he didn't discuss any of this. He never brought it up. They really felt remorse for having to shoot Bonnie because they knew that she hadn't committed any crime. She was only guilty of association. She never fired a weapon at anybody. She hated the weapons, but she was accomplished because she might have drove the car a few times, but she didn't participate in any bank robberies. And the only person she ever shot was herself by accident when she tried to keep a pistol from falling off the bed, and it went off and shot her in the toe, in the foot. And so she's the only one she ever shot.
Buddy, if you'll talk a little bit about some of the crimes that they were accused of that they couldn't possibly have done. But, once people said it was a man and a woman that came in the bank, people just locked that right on top of them.
Yeah, there was an incident where a bank was robbed, and they described, of course, they didn't have any of these photographs of Clyde and Bonnie at the time, and they said it was a man and woman who walked in the bank, robbed them, and said it was a man who was 6 foot tall, blonde-headed, blue-eyed, and the little dark-headed 5'5", woman, and Then when they actually got the photographs, they found out that it wasn't Bonnie and Clyde. What they had actually done, the bank before the bank failed, they robbed themselves and blamed it on Bonnie and Clyde because they knew the bank was fixing to fail. So they made sure they got their money back. It's like the people who had money in the bank lost their money.
Wow.
So that went on many times, and it's like there was many times they were at my grandfather's filling station, and a bank got robbed in Illinois, and they're sitting right here in Dallas, Texas. But you had a lot of copycat criminals going on at the same time. It was happening all over the United States. If you had a man and woman that were robbing or stealing, it was automatically Bonnie and Clyde because they were already the most noted bank robbers or not bank robbers. He hated banks, but as far as robbing banks, but it was a man and woman, regardless of the crime. It was already Bonnie and Clyde because they were the most elusive, hardest to catch, and never could pin them down, because they could be in Texas one time and all the way up the Canadian border by the next couple of days, and then from there they'd go to the East Coast and they'd go to the West Coast, and they were all over the place. And law enforcement wasn't going to do that. They weren't going to live like that. They didn't stay in the best hotels. They stayed in a car, bathe in rivers, and eat out of a sardine can. And then when they were shot and wounded, they learned to dress their own wounds. And to this day, I don't understand how they did not get gangrene from all the bullet wounds that they ever received, because that's usually what happens.
Yeah, especially back then.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
I was just going to say, it's been noted that Clyde could drive 1,000 miles a day. I mean, you're talking about crisscrossing the country. There's no way law enforcement could keep up with that.
Yeah.
So even if you thought, well, I'm going to call over to Oklahoma, or I'm going to, call over Kentucky, they're way past you. I mean, there was just no way to do that back in the 30s.
And all they were doing was stealing, like I said, stealing to buy gasoline, food, to survive. They never really gained any kind of big money except when they had some of their cohorts that were running with them. They were more interested in the money. Clyde told his mom, he said, Mom, all the money in the world is never going to set me free. All I want to do is live another day, get down the road, and I'm not interested in money because I can't spend it. I can't go nowhere to spend it. Well, what good is it?
Yeah.
That goes back to his childhood.
But if you would, what is something that most people don't know about your uncle that's very interesting, or do you think people would have interest in?
Well, the boy was he was multi-talented. He could play just about any kind of musical instrument. My aunt said she loved to listen to Clyde play the saxophone because he could play Melancholy Baby. That was her favorite. So he was quite talented, and he could play the guitar, the piano, the saxophone, just anything he set his mind to do, he could do. And one thing he always said, he said, if you're going to be good at something, you might as well be the best. And he said his tone to that way. And he could build things. He used his hands. While he was in prison, he made just about every family member something that he made while he was, whether it was jewelry, whether it was mirrors. He had a God-given talent, but yet fate would never open the door for him to have a civilized, or I would say just open a door to where he could have an easy pathway to use his talents. But when he became a criminal, he used his talents because he used his mind to outthink his pursuer. And that was one thing he did do.
We were sitting at a bar Saturday night talking, and he told a story I had never heard in my life, and that was that his grandmother had gotten shot. So, Buddy, talk about that a little bit.
My dad had just got out of prison for an armed robbery. He got 5 years for an armed robbery he did not commit. when he got out of prison, there was an article that came out in the paper where Bob Alcorn and Ted Hinton admitted that my dad had no part in that robbery because they were sitting there watching him whenever the robbery took place. But they said they were never called as witnesses and never was able to give the testimony. But my dad got 5 years on armed robbery just because he was a Barrow. Now, when he got out of prison, there was a guy there. West Dallas was full of people who were jealous of Clyde Barrow because, you know, he built a name for him. And a lot of these other guys were like old gunslingers. I'm a faster gun than you, and I want to prove it. Well, there was a guy by the name of Baldy Watley. He was a gun runner, and he robbed these U.S. armories of the weapons, stashed them in a particular house. These outlaws knew where these weapons were. They didn't have to go to the army to get the weapons, but they would go into this house, leave the money for the weapons, because that's honor among thieves, and take the weapons, and that's the way it was. And Baldy was jealous of Clyde. Baldy was jealous of the Barrow family. But anyway, my dad was there. You know, they were giving him a welcome home party. And Baldy was sitting inside. My dad had gone outside to wait for one of his brother-in-laws to show up. Baldy said something about derogatory about the Barrow family through the window. My dad went in there and confronted Baldy. Well, my dad's brother-in-law, you know, got testy and hit Baldy with a pair of brass knucks. And Baldy got mad and set up an ambush out in front of the Barrow filling station where my grandfather had set up a business. And my grandmother, you know, it was getting pretty close, 10 o'clock at night, and the party had ended. And my aunt, her husband, and then a couple of brother-in-laws pulled up in front of the station. And Baldy thought one of the guys was my dad, and he opened fired with a automatic shotgun. And my grandmother had gone to sleep. They didn't have no air conditioning in the house, and they slept with the windows open. And she had positioned herself right in front of the open window. One of those shots went in, hit my grandmother in the face, put her eye out, shot her in the chest, and she became almost died because of it. And this same guy, within the next 6 months, throwed out sticks of dynamite, and one of them landed right by the fuel pump, and it didn't go off. And I got a picture of my grandfather holding that stick of dynamite. Well, Baldy eventually got caught, and you know he received a sentence for you know, attempted murder and all that stuff. But that's the way it was in West Dallas at that time. And this, like I said, this was in 1938. So, you know, that's one thing that happened. And of course, the story was my aunt had, my grandfather was asleep out in a cot out in front of the filling station, and he kept a 45 under his pillow. And my aunt ran over there and got the 45 and returned fire at Baldy, and he hooked him.
Buddy, I'd like to have you back on again if you don't mind. I'd like to continue our conversation.
Like I said, I got more time than I got money.
It's really been a pleasure speaking with you, and that's what I think is important, is that the facts come out.
If they're going to make them part of history, the truth, you know, tells a whole lot better story than all this fictitious romance stuff, because there was nothing romantic about it. I mean, other than Clyde and Bonnie had vowed themselves to, you know, live what they could in, you know, and they wanted to go out together, and they did.
Yeah.
And that's what fascinates a lot of people, because they don't understand this love story. And I asked a young couple one time, and I said, "Y'all are married, right?" And he said, "Oh, yeah. I said, "You love each other, right?" She said, "Yes." So I said, "Let me ask you something, young lady." I said, "Would you die for him?" She turned around, she looked at him, she said, "Sorry, Buster." I said, "I rest my case."
Well, there you go.
It has been a pleasure speaking with you, and I would love to have you back on, and we'll do that soon, I hope. Cheryl, I've enjoyed having you on the show again. You're becoming a regular.
Thank you.
We're going to have to put you on the radio staff, I think. Cheryl, how does somebody?
Hey, you'll have a sold out program, I guarantee you.
Well, she's an amazing guest, and we enjoy having her on. She's an amazing person. Cheryl, how does somebody get a hold of you at the Cold Case Investigative Research Institute?
They can get a hold of us through Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, or they can get a hold of us through our website email at coldcasecrimes.org. And Stephen, thank you. It's been a great time.
Are you prepared? Legacy Food Storage. The best way to protect your family is by being prepared. Go now to legacyfoodstorage.com. Use coupon code HOM15 now for 15% off. Quick, go!
You've been listening to Crime and Forensics with Stephen David Lampley, your crime and forensic source from coast to coast.
Music by JasonLampley.com.